Welcome back to the channel, boys and girls. Great to have you along today. I had an interesting question burning in my noggin the other day, which is just really, modern fighting games have moved on quite a lot in terms of what they're capable of gameplay-wise. And I'd wondered, which of them would be considered most realistic. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about which of these fighters is the best. That's entirely subjective and depends entirely on your preferred gameplay style. However, they all have their strong points and weak points when it comes to realism. Now, I find myself in a unique position to be able to comment with some authority on this topic. I've been a martial arts coach in a weapons-based martial art for the last 8 years, and I've been practicing that martial art for 16 years. And I've done some hand-to-hand stuff as well. I follow UFC, I have some basic understanding of things like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and wrestling and fundamentals of boxing. Enough to make, to be able to kind of join the dots here and give you an informed perspective on which of these might be considered most realistic. Now, I've got 3 titles lined up to talk about today. I've got MK11, Tekken 7, and Street Fighter 5. I've picked those because really they're the biggest fighters with the furthest reach. There's a couple that have comparable reach that are not on this list, Killer Instinct being one, but this is a PlayStation orientated channel, and well, Killer Instinct is a Microsoft exclusive, so unfortunately that kind of rules it out. But you can see that in a similar light to MK11 because unlike in the earlier generation games, the physics of the games are kind of similar now, and they've kind of embraced a similar or comparable direction. Tekken and Soul Calibur have a lot in common. Like, Soul Calibur is sort of like Tekken with weapons, and so really I only have to talk about Tekken, I believe, to be able to sort of cover that ground. And there's a lot of games that just fall into that sort of clone category where they're like, they're blatantly modeled on one of these big 3. Anyway, the last one on the list is Street Fighter, so in particular Street Fighter 5, just because it's the latest version. But you could easily swap any Street Fighter into this bracket if you ask me. There are some changes in the game and some additional moves that weren't in the earlier versions, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the bread and butter of the gameplay is so similar that you could drop any Street Fighter game into this. Okay, so we're going to break this up into 2 sections. We're going to talk about offline, briefly, because I think it does matter. I think it's worthwhile talking about that because for a lot of players, not the majority I don't think, not by a long shot, but a significant portion of players don't really venture into online territory, certainly not ranked matches and things like that. And so they probably focus mostly on arcade modes, and therefore the AI has a big say in how realistic or unrealistic the game is. So, how do you define realism? What qualities are we looking for to define, what contributes to realism in video games? I think firstly, you've got to respect the physics of the real world. So things like characters bouncing off the floor is kind of a downside. That's very unrealistic. When people fall down onto a hard surface, they fall with a thud and they kind of stay there. The realism of the techniques. So things like, would you really do a Kazuya spinning, jumping uppercut? No, you probably wouldn't, because your opponent would see it from a mile away. So like telegraphing is quite an important thing. In real fighting, you don't want to telegraph your moves. Sometimes you do, because you're trying to lay a bit of a trap. You know, you want them to see that you're going to pressure a certain point, but really it's because you're going to attack somewhere else. So telegraphing is an important one. And the next thing I would say is going to be pressure. Pressure is, you know, it comes to opening opportunities. You know, so it's how do you go about opening the opportunities for attack in the game. A good example would be a boxer laying in jabs so that you raise your hands and protect your face, and then going in for body shots, you know, to the liver to actually do the damage to you. And then when your hands drop to protect that bit that's getting hurt, then they go for the knockout punch, you know, to your jaw that you've left unprotected. That's pressure. That's opportunity building. And then the last thing I would say is consequences. So in real life, whether it's weapons or hand-to-hand combat, there are immediate and obvious consequences, and with certain techniques, it's like the consequences are final. Okay, so in real life, if you have a character who has a katana, a Japanese sword, which is a sword of, you know, that is used expressly for cutting, you know, and if you had a character that used a saber, you know, it's for slashing, you know, or they're using something akin to a foil, which is for, you know, thrusting and stabbing. It's like a needle. There's certain consequences to that. But if you swing a katana at a player's neck and you do like 3 or 4 slashes or something like that, that person is dead. In real life, that person's dead. I mean, they only needed a little nick across one of those arteries, and they're done. Unless, you know, there's an expert surgeon, like a surgical team even, that just, you know, stood there in the background waiting to help them. Anyway, so my point is, there's consequences to your actions, to your errors, and as a result, the rhythm of the fight is a little bit different. In real life, things are more carefully considered, and it's less of a kind of button bashing fest, which is how fighting games kind of tend to play out sometimes. So back to offline mode, the AI is very important, because if you don't feel these things coming from the AI, you're not going to fight in a realistic way. And unfortunately, none of these 3 games have shown me any signs that the AI have moved on significantly enough to make the player feel something comparable to realistic pressure and realistic consequence. And certainly 2 of these games, the physics are way off the charts. Well, one of them in particular is so far off the charts for unrealistic, you know, characteristics. The other one is sort of maybe medium, and then one of them is actually surprisingly not too bad. So I'm gonna leave kind of offline park there, because the AI, you know, you can get away with murder. You can still kind of just spam the hell out of AI with projectiles, or you know, it doesn't take a lot to fool the AI in any of these games. Like with Paul Phoenix, you can use his, you know, semicircle forward triangle power punch, and you can smash your way through the first, you know, few fights in arcade mode or survival mode or something like that with relative ease. You could feasibly just beat them with that move, you know, just timing it right. And in MK, they're good to the point of defense. So if you do, say you're a scorpion and you open up with a teleport all the time, the game will start to punish you for it. It will start kind of registering like this guy's a teleporter, or he's a jump-in fighter, and it will start to counter with anti-air and stuff like that. But as long as you have some basic variety in your approach, you don't need to know a lot, and you don't need to be able to apply real pressure, and you can beat the game's arcade mode, and you can play like Towers of Time and you can advance through most of the towers very easily. It's not too much of a challenge, as long as you just know basic variety of moves. So I would say maybe like MK11 is kind of like quite technique orientated. If you know a good variety of techniques, you'll be alright offline. If you play Tekken 7, it's a similar sort of thing. So when you start to get a bit of resistance to one move that you've kind of been spamming, you know, if you know a couple of other moves and you can just mix it up a little bit, the AI then kind of struggles to keep up. Street Fighter is probably the worst of the AI in my experience, because you really can just spam your way through the whole game. Previous versions, the boss fights, you couldn't really get away with that, and that's true of most boss fights, because the bosses are sort of a bit OP, but then it's not because they're smart, it's just because they're OP. So let's park that there. You know, offline really doesn't give an accurate picture of the complexities of the games, and it doesn't do them justice. But if I had to pick one, if I was forced to pick one that felt the most natural, it's a toss-up probably between Tekken and MK11. I would say maybe MK11 just edges it a little, because there's enough variety with what they do that fights don't feel too samey. It doesn't feel like you can just do the same move all the time and make it through most of the fights. Okay, so let's move on to online, because this is where the interesting stuff lies. So we'll start with Mortal Kombat, because it's the most, I think it's the most flashy. So when it comes to techniques, Mortal Kombat is just so far from reality. It's not completely removed. There are some genuine martial art kind of styles and things like that involved, but it's the most stylized representation of that. There's often kicks in the game where the kicks don't even make contact with the opponent's face, but the hit is registered as a kick to the face, you know, like a high kick. But often, I mean, you're kicking them, like, if you're lucky, you are actually kicking them in the face, it's like in the forehead, which is the strongest part of the head. That isn't going to do a lot. It just isn't. Whereas if you kick them in the jaw, you know, that would be devastating. But in terms of things like opening opportunities, it's not too bad. So all of these games, I think, have this in common. This idea that, you know, if your opponent starts to defend, if they block high, attack low. If they block low, you can overhead them or you can throw them. And, you know, it's interesting because I'm surprised that there isn't a little bit more. Well, they have added some extra grappling to MK, but it's by far dominated by combo work. I would say that's probably the main thing that kind of separates Mortal Kombat's mechanics. Is this idea that once there is an opportunity opened, it's almost always going to result in some type of combo. And if the person who's executing the combo is competent at juggling, then it's unlikely you're going to get out of it. I mean, you have opportunities to come back and break, things like that, but you have to use them very sparingly. And if you've got one player with really great knowledge of the combo system and another who only has intermediate knowledge, the chances of the intermediate player overcoming the advanced player is very unlikely. And so for pressure, I would say, because of this factor, the pressure meter for Mortal Kombat is actually very high, because this leans into consequences, which is basically if you make a mistake in Mortal Kombat, I think it punishes, the opportunity for somebody to punish you badly in Mortal Kombat is very high. So although it scores down for the techniques, like, because you can teleport and you can do really ridiculous stuff and like carry like weapons without consequences, no weight burden, or do you know what I mean? Like, you can just whip out a you know, like a mounted machine gun and things like that. Yeah, you know, there's just ridiculous things, like you can conjure things and stuff like that. And as I say, teleports in particular just break real physics. Also, the juggling mechanics kind of break that physics as well. But it does have a good pressure system, and it does have a good consequence system. And, you know, the characters bleed, there's a visual feedback mechanism for that. And that's great. But it's also like, obviously, you know, in terms of the moves, like if you cut someone in the way that you get cut, or stab someone in the way that you get stabbed in Mortal Kombat, particularly in like the fatal blows and things like that, like obviously in the real world they would be dead, but I kind of bring that into the technique section where the techniques themselves are unrealistic. But as I say, it has dire consequences when your guard gets broken and there's a genuine opportunity on the table. Now, let's move on to Tekken. Tekken's a bit different. I think it plays more naturally, so when it comes to technique, it's much more representative of kind of like real traditional martial arts. Like, for example, like the Eddie Gordo type character. You know, that kind of capoeira style. That, I mean, that's that is a real thing, and it's, you know, it's got some effective movesets, but some of it's really not great for competitive fighting, but it doesn't matter because, like I said, this is entertainment, so it doesn't get it all right on technique, but it's a little bit closer to things you would see in real life. So like, you know, there's characters that would like use like proper, like almost textbook taekwondo kicks and things like that, and so it does well on the technique front. Probably, you know, when it comes to like the techniques, I think Tekken is actually probably in the lead, you know, like, so for instance, like Tekken actually has ground and pound in it. Now the ground and pound is actually underpowered, I think. It's undervalued. It should have more impact, should take more damage. It doesn't, because in real life, you can't generate a lot of power from ground and pound punches, but you can lay them in repetitively. They're really hard to deal with and protect against. But anyway, it has this thing, you know, where you can ground and pound, and if you finish it, you can get it into an armbar. And that is a real, genuine thing. You'll see it in UFC a lot, you know. Ground and pound and into armbar, ground and pound, you know, into a triangle, or, you know, something like that. Basically into a submission hold. Where Tekken kind of falls down is the consequence side of that. And, you know, so there's some devastating moves that can happen. And some of them are kind of realistic, but there's not enough consequence, as I said. So something like ground pound into an armbar, that would normally be something that can finish a fight. If not finish the fight, you break one of their arms and they can't use it anymore. So the consequence is dire, and that doesn't happen in Tekken. Obviously, you go on and fight. As far as physics are concerned, the juggle dynamics in Tekken, they're somewhere between. They're not as restricted as Street Fighter, but they're not quite as flamboyant as Mortal Kombat. And so I would kind of put that somewhere in the medium bracket. So Tekken does quite well for techniques. It does not so great for consequences. And for the physics, it's kind of in the middle. So let's move on to Street Fighter. Street Fighter for me is a bit of a surprising one. So, as I mentioned earlier, Street Fighter hasn't really changed a whole lot. You could play the first Street Fighter or the second Street Fighter, and there's a bunch of characters in there where you could just jump into Street Fighter 5 and you straight away you would know all the moves that you need really to be able to compete. And yeah, you'd be fine. You know, it might feel a little bit faster than the original games, depending on which version you played, of course, whether it was a turbo version or not. But fundamentally, you can fight, and that's because there's a lot of very realistic gameplay elements actually in Street Fighter, and it's my most realistic pick actually. So that's it. Goodbye now. You can go. Now I'll explain myself a little bit more, because you might be, thinking that why, it's a cartoon game, but you got to look beneath the visuals. Okay, so Street Fighter has the pressure mechanics. Okay, so if you If they guard high, you hit low. If they guard low, you can overhead, you can throw. You know, there's ways to force their guard open. And you have to do it with pressure. You have to get in and be aggressive and get up close. You can spam it out a bit, but it never works for online play. Online players are smart enough that spam doesn't really go anywhere in Street Fighter. It's the easiest one to overcome unrealistic spamming movements, in my opinion, for most characters. Now, it's not a slam dunk, but it's definitely out in the lead on that front. The next thing is in terms of the physics. The physics are not like wildly out of proportion. Sure, you can jump quite high into the air, but it's kind of slow and it can be costly. So if you're overly like too much of a jumpy player, it is quite traditional in its jumps. So you can do those jumps more often than you can in, say, modern Mortal Kombat. But if you do that too much, it's very easy to be severely punished for doing it. And there's enough anti-airs to kind of like cancel it out, so it's not a big issue. But it obviously it's a big help in overcoming like spammy projectiles and things like that. Anyway, so this, for me, the pressure is really there. It's kind of more than halfway up on my meter for techniques, because there's a lot of genuine, straight up, genuine martial arts moves in there, like good crosses, good jabbing. There's a strong focus on jabs. There's you know, things like axe kicks, roundhouses, spinning back kicks. These are all actual kicks that can be used and are proven effective in real hand-to-hand combat. There's maybe a little bit of underrepresentation in grappling, depending on the character. So you have to be playing a wrestler to be able to do wrestling. But that's true of all these games. You know, they're incredibly stylized and each character has their own kind of unique set identity, and therefore they're really restricted in terms of style. Whereas in modern fighting, if you want to be competitive, you kind of need to have a good library across all those skill sets. You need to be able to strike competently, you need to be able to wrestle competently, you need to be able to grapple, you know, and lock and submit effectively if you want to be able to compete. Certainly at that sort of, you know, at an elite level, cross-discipline. But it's got because the throws are relatively powerful, you know, the basic standard throw, because they're relatively powerful for every character, there's a good consequence to that. So if you get caught being overly defensive and you get thrown, you will pay the price for that. And I think that's the next area where I think Street Fighter is quite good. And it sort of edges the other two out a little bit in this, which is, well, maybe not so much MK11. MK11 is maybe a little bit OP in this, but it's the consequences factor. So if you mess up, the consequences are dire in Street Fighter, but they're not so dire that the fight is just basically over. Whereas in MK11, it can feel like that, unless the two players are like incredibly well matched at an elite level. It's not that well balanced if there's a bit of even a small disparity in skill level. Whereas in Street Fighter, it's really, in my opinion, from my experience, well balanced on that. So the consequences are dire and you pay for them, but it's not to the point where it's like you can't get out of the situation, there's no way out. Where Street Fighter lacks is obviously it doesn't have that sort of realistic 3D plane of movement, but then even though Tekken has that, you can kind of duck in and dive out, and I really do value that in terms of realism. I don't think it's an important contributing factor here because you can't block or defend in that 3D plane of movement. So for example, you can't block specifically to stop a cross, or block specifically to stop a roundhouse or something like that. You can only move completely off that centerline axis, if that makes sense. And so I don't think it's that much of a factor. I think mostly these games, they still play out mostly in a 2D field of motion. And that's why I don't think that's really too much of a factor. So Street Fighter does have special moves, it does have some ridiculous techniques, but the bread and butter of how you win and how you create opportunities, how the pressure feels to you and how you deliver the pressure, overall I think it just edges it and it doesn't play at a ridiculous breakneck speed as well, which is a bit different from the other two. The other two have gotten quite fast. MK is on the extreme side, Tekken's kind of in the middle, and Street Fighter is the most natural and most realistic feeling because you know, that's kind of, it's closer to how human beings really move. You're not as fast as you think you are. And all you need is for somebody to videotape you training and you realize that that is the case. Now, elite level athletes, they do look fast because they are fast, but it takes a lot of training to get there. So, anyway, that's my thoughts on the matter. I think Street Fighter just edges it, with Tekken probably in a close second, and Mortal Kombat's kind of tagging on at the end there. But if you were to flip it on entertainment value, I think Mortal Kombat is way out in front just because of sheer diversity and graphic prowess, and then it's a close fight between, you know, kind of Tekken and Street Fighter for kind of second place and third place. Let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and take care. We'll see you around. Bye bye. Hey guys, really great to have you along today. I hope you enjoyed the content. Be sure to leave us a thumbs up and a comment if you did. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for future content. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of our videos.